I just jump right in. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Jim and Lisa for inviting me. I apologize for not being here yesterday. I just got in from Ethiopia. So it's been over 30 years since I did the first value of time study in my career. It was a small little study in Kenya. It was done at World Bank consultancy, and I just saw this opportunity to try to estimate the value of time spent from saving time and water. And I didn't have time to do literature review or really do any methodological work. I just grabbed some data. I didn't realize how thin this literature was. It's still thin 30 years on. I didn't estimate the value of time again until 2005, and it was again a situation where a natural experiment arose in Mozambique. I was not again in this job to estimate the value of time. It was a situation which just arose, and I grabbed it. I think a lot of the people working in value of time are probably in the same situation. They're not value of time specialists. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. It's not a sector that one specializes in. So the literature is often quite thin. So let me just jump in. The issue that we're going to think about is that development projects change households' time allocation. And this can be a positive or negative. Most of the time we're going to be looking at positive changes, welfare gains. There's almost no literature on welfare losses, but conceptually, of course, it could be important. But we're going to be talking about value of time savings that are welfare gains. So the benefit estimation is really quite simple, as it's done in most benefit cost analysis. We estimate the time that's saved at the household level or individual level, and then we multiply it by a shadow value of time. I'll call it a VOL, sometimes called VTT, value travel time. I don't want to underestimate the importance of actually the empirical problems of estimating the quantities here, but that's not primarily what I'm going to be talking about. It's really quite challenging to estimate in a field setting in developing countries how many hours of time change. And there's a lot of new work on this, actually. Okay, so two things about the value of time to start. It's likely to vary across sectors. There's no real reason to think that an hour saved in transport's the same as an hour saved in a queue, or in fact, we're kind of aware of this, but it should be kind of VOT indexed on the particular activity that we're involved in. There's also no reason to think it's the same across individuals. There could be a lot of heterogeneity across individuals, given particular constraints people face in their jobs and lives, and the value of time also could change for a given individual over time, depending on what is going on for them at any particular moment. So what do we know about the value of time in industrialized countries? Well, for time use changes that occurred during the workday for salaried employees, there's a clear recommendation coming out of theory that we should use the before tax market wage data to estimate the value of time, including employees' benefits and indirect cost of employee supervision. If the individual can trade off time and savings and work, even time savings outside of the salary day should be informed by the wage data, but then we would use the after-tax market rate. These are just the kind of conventional recommendations that come out of work in industrialized countries. And if the time savings occur outside the salary workday and the individual cannot trade off time and work, well, then we don't have so much help with theory here. We've got to go measure things. And based on empirical evidence in industrialized countries, the mean values, mostly based on transport studies suggest that we should use about 50% of the after-tax market wage for the value of time. For walking, this industrialized countries, people don't like to walk as much, at least that's what the data says. We use 100%, and they particularly hate to queue. So queuing is particularly disliked. So you can think of it as a transport study. If you're in your car driving, 50% of the after-tax market wage rate. If you're walking, 100%. If you're employment, you use the average household before tax market wage rate plus benefits plus cost of employee supervision. If it's after work hours, but you still have opportunities to do work, or you can expand your work day, you say from 5 to 10, you use the average household after tax. And then for time that you can't convert to income generating activities, we've got to go measure stuff and use empirical estimates, where we usually get something around 50% of the after tax market wage. So what's different in developing countries? Well, first off, most of the activities outside the formal sector, more activities outside the formal sector. So we're kind of in that area where we got to measure things, less reliance on theory. Second thing is that we've got, in general, fewer lower taxes on income. So the distinction between before and after tax wages is less important. And finally, the data on time savings and wage rates may be harder to obtain from secondary sources. So there's a greater need in general for primary data collection all the way around, not just on the value of time, but on the wage rate and time savings as well. So what we did, we reviewed 10 papers that estimated the value of time in developing countries. Again, I said the literature was thin. All but 2 of these were published in the last 10 years. Half of them were from Africa, 3 from Kenya, 4 from Asia. 2 of these are from China, 1 from Latin America, Costa Rica. They used both of the methods that have been used in industrialized countries. 5 used revealed preference methods, 3 used stated preference methods, and 2 used both. 4 report value of time estimates for the transport sector, 4 report value of time estimates for the water supply sector, the value of time spent collecting water. 5 are in urban areas, 4 in rural areas, 1 in small towns. So it's a pretty good spread. I mean, they're all over. It's such a small sample, it's hard to generalize. But at least they're not all on one sector in one continent, on using one method. So what do we find? Well, actually, there's a surprising consistency in the value of time estimates in this literature. 8 of the 10 studies report mean value of time estimates that fall in the range of 25 to 75% of some measure of the household income or wage rate. I mean, it's a stretch perhaps to say there's no systematic difference, but there's not an obvious difference in the small set between the stated preference and revealed preference data. There's almost no evidence in developing countries on the value of time spent waiting or queuing, and there's almost no evidence on the value of time for welfare losses. Joe Cook and colleagues have a new tool for measuring the value of time using a stated preference approach. They've tested this in Kenya. And so we actually, in addition to this literature review, in terms of some estimates on the value of time from the literature, we now have a new tool. This was just published in the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis in 2016. So our recommendations in this guidance document draw on both, the possibility of using this new tool and also the findings from a rather limited literature. I'll just show you the new tool. Joe Cook used a very simple stated preference approach, a discrete choice approach, where we actually just try to focus people's attention on a choice between 2 water points. But it could be a transport choice. And we ask people to compare your current source to 2 possible new sources, and we look here at the trade-off of multiple tests. So you can change, you can choose a water source with different combinations of cost per jerry can and the time to walk. And so you get that trade-off. Now, if you picked point A in this choice task, you know the respondent's not paying attention because point B is obviously preferred to point A. But in general, we would randomize these time to walk and cost of the water source to just focus on what people tell us about their trade-off between time and money. So here are our recommendations. So step one, the first thing is to see if the majority of time changes in a development project are being devoted to income-generating activities. If they are, then you use the average household after-tax or take-home wage rate as a value of time. So we go back to our microeconomic theory. If most of the time savings are not devoted to income-generating activities, we suggest doing a sensitivity analysis around the value of time, so 25 to 75% of the after-tax market wage, and see if this matters. If it doesn't matter, you're probably okay to pick something in this range and move on. If not, if it matters, then you really need to think about doing primary data collection, and we've got a new tool, in the literature to do this. The caveat on this really is if you care about the distribution of benefits and costs. If this is especially important to you, and in the water sector, for example, it often is especially important on women and children, then we suggest doing primary data collection because that's the only way you're going to be able to estimate the heterogeneity in the value of time across households. So if you really care about distribution on this development project, you're not going to get it from the literature as we know it today. And so that's another reason why you may want to do primary data collection. Am I on time? 2 minutes. Okay, good.
Thank you, Dale. I'd like to invite Abusaleh Shariff to provide comments.
Thank you, Brad. And I guess my PowerPoint is somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry for all that colorful things. I hope you like them. This is what I generally do. Promote my institution. I run a U.S. India Policy Institute. So the most important thing is I do agree with the recommendations on this paper. I'm very happy this paper doesn't yet carry a lot of formulas and estimation procedures. That is yet to come. That shows that there is very little data on this topic. The topic is no less important than what we are discussing about the impact on mortality, because we have seen the mid-90s in India particularly, and also South Africa, I suppose, there is a large number of research on time use in mid-90s. We have done those surveys, we have analyzed that, and we did find a huge impact on women's time. Particularly this was the context of measuring women's time. And what created some of those very important data is the major revolution which has happened in India for the last 30, 40 years is fertility decline. We had an average of fertility rate of somewhere around 5.5 children being born in 1960s, 70s, and we have reduced that to very close to 2. 2.2 maybe in a couple of states in UP, Bihar, but much less in Kerala. Kerala is below replacement. Tamil Nadu is below replacement. There is a huge diversity. So there is an improvement, and there is a huge diversity in improvement. This paper, which has analyzed, doesn't really account for those secular changes which do take place in less developed countries and middle income countries. However, this paper context is on the project, as if we implement a project, let's say on water, and then we do probably before and after comparisons, and I'm not clear the databases which you use or analyze did have sampling procedures and before and after contact. So there would be a huge confounding factors which emerge from the program effect versus the project effect that I would like to bring to your knowledge. So isolating project effect are important study. I'm just trying to give the importance to the fast pace in which things are changing. I call them revolutionary times. So fast declining fertility, as you mentioned. So time at disposal is changing, and it is also changing both the market and non-market rate of return. So just a clarification, market wage is very easy to measure if somebody is paid in cash, and also paid in kind. But in the Indian context, now there's a lot of work which women do which are not paid at all. So the important point is, should we value that time which has no premium value in monetary terms in less developed countries? And I presume so. Things are changing there. Female literacy is increasing. There are no opportunities, but women are willing to work. So you have this complex system in which the wage labor market is working, but the opportunities for women's employment is tremendous and huge. So evaluating that time is very important. Now, the other revolutionary changes are that we used to have a literacy rate of less than 40, just 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Now our literacy rates are around 65. Female literacy is also increasing. And I know that there are two women professors here with us. And for your surprise, our university student sex ratio is now tilting, favoring women. So it so happens that women who are not encouraged to go out to work, they have better opportunity to continue education when compared to men or boys who are pushed to work much earlier because of various economic factors. So this is the kind of things happening. So technology is another thing which is changing the way people, whether men or women, can use their extra time. So there are a lot of things which can happen today at home, and you may be surprised to know that the mobile penetration in India is almost closer to 85%. Some of the poorest of the poor people can afford a cell, and our cell rates cannot be compared to AT&T in USA. The caution here is not a single wage. You have recognized this point, but it is very important to collect this data. So the two most important things here, the parameters is often value of women is not evaluated. There is a satellite accounting system in India. I would appreciate if you can use some of the Indian data, and the government has recognized creating a satellite GDP, adjusting for women's work, which actually increases or enhances GDP substantially. We will be much richer if we count those data. The marginal value of time affected by an array of diversity in time use and its associated values. The challenges are diversity of market wage and diversity in the structure to evaluate the non-market rate of return. Data analysis, we need to create new databases because some of the data which are used to me are very, very old or outdated. Things are changing fast, so I agree with your recommendation that we need to consider creating some databases. Benefit transfer approach appear not easy and effective, and your discounting, taking pre and post-tax discounting factor appears to me irrelevant, at least in a less developing context. So thank you very much. I just want to end this with a map. So this is how diverse India is. They have taken a diversity map of development using economic, education, health index, and you see there's a huge diversity within India at the level of the district. So the capturing diversity is would be a challenge for our analysis. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks. Thank you, Abu. I'd like to invite Jim Neumann to take the stand and.
You don't need to see my slides, but you might want to.
Oh, okay.
Down here. It's up to you how awkward it is. So thanks a lot, Brad. Thanks, Dale, for a nice paper. And and when Lisa asked me to be a discussant on this paper, I think she knew that I'd spent a little bit of time in the context of air pollution analyses, at least in the U.S., thinking about value of time. In the U.S. context, that's basically how much time we queue up at inspection and maintenance centers to get our cars certified for the year. And in fact, that's true in international settings, some international settings as well. She may not have known that I've done a little bit of thinking about it in the context of Santiago's air pollution plans, which include basically telling people they can't get in their cars on certain days because the air pollution levels are so high and they have to stay at home. What she might not have known is what's on the second slide here when it comes up, which is that I'm a more active consumer of this literature in international settings. So that's not up here yet. So what you'll see when the slide comes up is that there's a book that we did recently with the World Bank that looks at the impact of climate change on transportation sector, and particularly on increasing the resilience of the transportation sector. So if you think about the pictures that are about to show up here that show how much. So there we go. There we go. So the book is the cover's on the left, and you can see the picture on the cover tells you a lot about what we were looking at. Essentially, you get flooding events and transportation gets stalled, and that leads to loss of people's time in different contexts. The pictures on the right are actually from the recent hurricane in Puerto Rico. But the point is, I'm a consumer of this literature, not a producer. But as a consumer, I'm a little skeptical about how precise we can be. But I'm not just going to throw rocks. I actually have a potential solution. So if I get to the end of my presentation, we can get to maybe a potential solution for how to deal with some of the issues that Dale's paper has highlighted. So I use Lisa's questions as a guide for my presentation here. Is the paper conceptually sound and technically accurate? The simple answer is yes. This 50% of wage rate for personal time is obviously widely used, as Dale's explained to you. The literature review for low and middle income contexts, even though the literature is thin, as Dale says, it does support this conclusion. I agree with their conclusion on that, and I think Dale and Joe Cook are right. The only alternative is state of preference analysis and doing surveys. And I actually like the Cook study quite a bit and think it's a good example to emulate. I don't know how difficult it is to actually implement it, and I have a point on that in a minute relative to the recommendations. Overall, I also found the paper very well written, which I'm grateful for because I was able to pick up the main points very quickly. A minor point, there's only one figure in this report, and it cries out for figures and tables and summary charts and stuff like that. I think it'll just come across better. Another question that we were asked to consider is, are the recommendations appropriate and practical? And I think that yes, but they might be a little too practical. And maybe, Dale, what I want to do is push you and Joe to think a little bit more, not just about simplifying this component of the benefit cost analysis, but also taking advantage of what you can learn from what I think is your very good literature review about heterogeneity of values, and particularly 3 dimensions in your benefits transfer that I think you can think more rigorously about. One is, what do we know from this literature about lessons for benefits transfer that relate to the characteristics of the population that we're considering, both in the studies and in the context that we're transferring to. What do we know about the overall context? You mentioned the one about whether the time substitution is for income generating activities or not, but I think there are some others that are actually drawn out in your literature review that you ought to consider. And then what do we know about the intervention characteristics in both in the study case and in the case we're transferring to? And I think thinking a little bit more rigorously about that in your recommendations, I think will do a real service to your readers. In general, I also think that there are some conditions in your literature review where willingness to pay is greater than 100% of the wage rate, and I think those are worth highlighting a little bit more in your recommendations. What are those conditions? And do you feel like there's any situation where you'd move beyond this 25 to 75% recommended range? I think as I've read the way you presented the recommendations today in your presentation, I think you would answer yes, there are some conditions. When I read it in the paper, it didn't come across as clearly. And I also think this 25 to 75% recommended range is too broad, that if you consider some of these factors in the benefits transfer, you can narrow it some, and that'll provide some interesting inputs for folks. Now on to potentially constructive suggestions. How can the paper and recommendations be improved? For the literature review, here are 3 references that I used as a consumer of this literature that I think that are missing from what you've done. One of them is primary research from Wondemu, and I think African Development Bank. His affiliation with that is a great source to be referring to. I think you could also do some looking around for Asian Development or an American Development Bank guidance on these sorts of things. The USDOT's guidance that's listed here, I don't think is super useful for these contexts, but I think you should at least cite it so people can look at it. And, you know, if you're looking at, for example, a freight versus a personal travel time, it provides some insights about how you could think about that. None of these additions will fundamentally change your conclusions of your literature review, I don't think, but here's where I'm going to start pushing a little bit more. I think you could say more about distinction between expected and unexpected delays. Those ought to affect valuation quite a bit. And I don't know how much literature you have to draw on that, but theoretically that should be a big factor in applying these values. Also, I think the most important advice that I would have based on reading your paper is that there are some huge uncertainties in these values. I mean, you say 25 to 75% of the wage rate. Actually, you could plausibly interpret your literature review as a factor of 5, 25% to 125%, depending on context. And because of that, I think you could acknowledge these uncertainties, or you could at least, I'm going to push you to consider an example like this of a break-even analysis, where you say, okay, let me first explain what's going on here, and then you can decide whether this makes any sense. Along the bottom here, we have sub-Saharan African countries, okay? And what we're looking at here are the potential to invest in climate resilience, okay? And what happens if you invest in climate resilience? Well, the road becomes passable more frequently, and therefore you reduce delays. That's one aspect of it. Also, if you make the capital investment to have a more durable road, you also reduce your maintenance costs. But there's uncertainty in protecting climate. So the bars, which don't show up really well here, but they're basically bars that go between the orange and the blue dots for each of these countries. Those represent a range of outcomes for a break-even value on the value of time. And so you're characterizing what the value of time needs to be in order for all the things that we understand better and their variability better. Those are the range of break-even values you might consider. And by the way, this is a log scale, which you may not be able to see on the left there. So there's a huge variability in things we understand. And then the green line is $10 a day, which is just a value we used as a marker, not saying it's applicable in all these countries, but it's just it's a benchmark for people to think about. So all the situations where the both ends of these bars are below or well below the green line, we're fine. We don't care so much about the value of time. It's when you get to the left of the graph and you see that uncertainty actually straddles the $10 per day value. Those are things where we need to think much harder. And then finally, because I hit the stop already, so I'm in minus 30-second time, which I've learned in this conference is okay. I saw this sentence and said, okay, here's my chance to pitch for the thing I talked about yesterday, which is economy-wide modeling. This sentence says, we're worried that some of these values we pull from the literature don't adequately account for a discounted stream of higher future earnings from improved investment in child's human capital because they don't understand these things very well. Well, guess what? We have a tool that can help. The economy-wide modeling tool, if they're properly configured, can actually help you think about some of these situations that Ken explained in one of his flowcharts yesterday. So you don't have to take this recommendation, Dale, but I think you could do a little cross-fertilization here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to invite Dale up to the front here and to respond to the comment. Abusaleh has to leave in 10 minutes or so. So if you could sequence the responses first to Professor Shariff and then to Jim.
Great comments. Thank you so much. First, I really take your point about lots of things going on. In my head, what you're arguing for is a much more careful awareness of what would be a dynamic baseline here before the development project is the intervention, that we have to realize that things are not static and changing quickly. And I think that's right. I mean, so that's an important point. Jim, great comments. Basically, I agree with him. I think that I appreciate the new references, and I'll take a careful look at those. I agree with your point about unexpected versus expected delays, certainly an issue. I just don't think we have the literature here to do a systematic literature review and try to explain this diversity of values of time that we see. So maybe the range was too big. That's certainly a judgment call. We really would like to know what is driving these differences in the value of time across time, places, and sectors. But I think that's just going to take more primary research. Even if I add these 3 studies to my 10, I'm not going to have enough to do anything really careful systematic analysis. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Dale and others? Yes, Anil. Anil, can you please go to the microphone?
Dale, there was one, I can't remember now the exact slide. Is it possible to put up Dale's presentation back on the screen?
It's coming. It's happening.
There was a point where you said that in terms of value and time, in one of your recommendations, you said something to the effect that then you use 50% of the wage rate. Okay. My question was this: time is fungible. So in a sense, you can't really, and people may be working any part of the day. So it's sort of very difficult to know whether the time that they took to fetch water or do something else was from their leisure time or was it from their real sort of productive work time, because time is infinitely fungible. So in some sense, there is no discontinuity there, and to sort of value their time in non-market activity at 100% of their wage rate, if it happens to be during office workday, and then to discount it by 50% if it happens to be in non-work hours, might be a little arbitrary and might not do full justice to the fact that people's work hours, again, to people's work hours being flexible and people being able to substitute their work for leisure at any time of the day.
Thanks, Anil. Maybe I wasn't clear. I mean, I certainly agree with your basic point. What we were trying to make a distinction here was between salaried work hours, where you may or may not have be able to add more salaried hours to your day. I mean, and so we agree that if the time savings are spent on income generation, we're not activities. We're not arguing for 50% of the non-market wage rate. What we're saying is that if actually, maybe I'll tell you a story. So I just this last year, I said it, I've only done a couple of these studies in my life. This last year, I ended up with an argument with a reviewer in a paper I just submitted to Water Resources Research. And oddly, the main critique came around the way we're valuing time in a calculation of coping costs for households in Kathmandu. And this reviewer was saying that he thought that the value of time that we should put on women's work should be time savings on water projects should be zero unless I have evidence that they're actually devoting these time savings to income generating activities. So he didn't accept the 50%. And unless I had concrete evidence for income generation that the value of time should be zero. That's what we're saying we don't agree with. We think there is evidence to say that, if time is devoted for leisure, we still have this trade-off, between money and time that the literature tells us is worth something. So, but we're not saying that it's always worth 50%. I mean, if there is income generation, if people are devoting time to income, we think that we can go up to 100% or more, depending on, as Jim said. I mean, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. But I do think there's a lot of labor market constraints and possibilities for why, time is not as easily fungible across activities as you might think. I mean, particularly for women in developing countries that just may not have for cultural, social, labor market constraints may not have as much ability to individually reallocate time as easily as I think, perhaps, you might. I don't know if that was your point. Maybe you can follow up.
No, I mean, I was thinking more of people in self-employment or women who work on their own farms. In a sense, they can vary their work hours any time of the day. Also, strictly from the being sort of a devil's advocate, a theorist, an economic theorist would sort of say people are sort of adjusting their hours so that the marginal utility of leisure is equal to the opportunity cost of their time. And so in a sense, if you value their time at zero, you are basically assuming that they don't get any utility from leisure at all.
Yeah, but what you're also saying is that in all of these studies, I should have been getting 100% of market wage rates, right? At the margin, people should be valuing their time at the after-tax market wage rate in all these poor settings, and maybe that's not what the evidence says. Yeah.
And you also rightly point out in the paper, and as you did in your presentation, that there's certain inflexibilities at the margin, right? You don't have full fungibility, as our last speaker had said. Yeah. Larry, right.
A conceptual question here. The idea of valuing work time at the after-tax wage rate, the logic of that is that's the social value of whatever would be produced while working. And so that ignores any utility gain or loss to the worker. I think it's analogous to cost of illness. Let's say you have an illness, but all your medical costs are paid by the government or some external source. We would use the cost of that treatment as a measure of the harm from the illness. And it is one component of the social harm because the resources going to medicine and so forth are consumed, but there's no component associated with the utility of the person. So working, obviously jobs differ, and sometimes when you're working, you're getting very high positive utility from it. Sometimes you're getting negative utility, sometimes extremely negative. So what is it we're trying to measure? Whereas the off the clock is a value of leisure time, which the logic there, I think, is the person values whatever they're doing more than the wage they could have made if they turned that hour into work hour. So it seems like the conceptual basis is quite different between the two. And what are we really trying to measure here?
So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that, Jim, but it's kind of like the value of mortality risk reduction. We've called this the value of life, right? We know that's not right. It's really the value of mortality risk. So we know that this value of time, it's not the value of time, it's a value of shifting time from one activity to another. And if that is, the individual is making that shift, is fully informed, and it seems to me that they would be taking the disutility of the work into account when they shifted. I don't see why it's left out. If we ask this question of a woman about, whether she would have more money or and less time spent walking, I think we're.
So you're talking about non-working hours.
Yes.
So I agree.
Well, I don't know what's working for a woman. Oh, okay.
But so for a person who has a salary, let's say, we're measuring the value of their time by the social product of what they are assumed to produce.
Yes.
And we're ignoring any gain or loss of their welfare.
Let me think about it.
It seems very much like a human capital measure. We value the person only by what they produce.
So that was my point about the value of these.
Well, no, it's actually a different point, I think. He's arguing for an adder for time spent in the workplace, not at the margin of labor and leisure, right? I actually think it's a reasonable point. I think that this is interesting, Jim, because we were told when writing the papers to stick to 10,000 words, and I think Dale made the right choice to devote most of his words to the literature review, where I think I think it's the best part of the paper, quite frankly. I think it's a wonderful critique, and it draws out all this heterogeneity, all these heterogeneity questions. It also points out some of the real pitfalls that a few of the analysts have fallen into. And I think less is devoted then to the front end, the conceptual framework, and where you're arguing is, well, this is a critique of those accepted conceptual frameworks. I think you made a good choice, Dale, in my opinion, to defer to others on the conceptual framework, because there's a lot that's been written on this in the industrialized context. So, but your point seems valid, and I don't see why it couldn't be added to the front end as part of the conceptual framework, and has nothing to do with your strong recommendation that in the state of preference context, those are the best values. People should be thinking about exactly what Jim's talking about if you ask them, which was your point.
So I'm Mead Over from the Center for Global Development. I have two questions. The first is very short. Can you describe, is there anything in the literature, or can you make any conjectures about the correlation between the value of a statistical life and the value of time use? The second refers to your use of the word change in your title. And we have experienced throughout this 2 days that the value of statistical life is also being estimated as a change, a small incremental change in probability of mortality. And yet there does exist an important paper in the literature on VSL, which hasn't been referenced, which attempts, it's a paper that's co-authored by Ken Arrow and Partha Dasgupta. It attempts to calculate the total value of wealth in 5 countries in the world: the United States, France, India, and a couple of others, Brazil. And it finds that in all 5 countries, the total value of health, when you apply the VSL method, accounts for 95% of the entire wealth of all 5 of those countries. Environment, physical stock of capital, everything else is rounding error. I asked Larry Summers about this point at one time when he came. He's on the member of the board of the Center for Global Development, so we get to see him now and then. And he said, well, he didn't agree at all with that because it's an example of what's called the integrability problem. That is, they're taking this marginal evaluation that comes from the VSL studies of a tiny change in probability of death, and they're extrapolating it back to zero. Suppose, and they're assuming that linear extrapolation would give them the total value of the stock of health. And I take that point. But then I'm now wondering whether in India, aren't they making that same error? They're not looking at changes in time use. They're attempting to value all of the working time of women. and add that to the GDP? Aren't they likely to make that same error and to dramatically exaggerate the value of women's time as a proportion of GDP?
So you're asking a question about the panelist's presentation is not here, I think, right? We can only do an incomplete job of trying to represent his views. But the same thought occurred to me as you were talking. Basically, there's a component that maybe isn't directly part of GDP, but is nonetheless necessary in order to achieve the levels of GDP that are observed and measured. And so, in this framework, what I think Dale's trying to do is rightly measure this as a change from that base. He's got no reference to GDP at all in what he's talking about. But I think if you're quibbling with the change piece, I don't know why I'm answering this, Dale, because this is your paper. But I think the title's right.
I was just going to say, Lisa, change exactly the title. I don't know.
I'm going to buck you up and say, don't change the title.
I mean, I do think that the language here matters, and we got ourselves into a box on VSLs, the value of a life, and it's the same kind of problem here on value of time. We're not really talking about giving people, you can give them a longer life. I mean, that's more time, but, within a 24-hour period, they don't get an extra hour. So thanks, Mead. I actually don't know the Indian story here, so I can't really comment any more on that. I mean, I don't know what they've done.
And in the data, is there any correlation?
Good question. Not that I don't know anybody that's. Yeah. I mean, there's some, but we could look. Yeah.
I don't recall that as a consumer, not a producer from this literature, that the conceptual framework for these value changes in time brings in mortality risk.
I mean, we certainly could do a discrete choice experiment that varied all of that, in one. That might be an interesting thing to do, varying mortality risk, money, and time savings at the same time. Certainly, there's no reason you couldn't do that.
And in the theoretical corner, you could say, sure, value of time is dependent on what you believe your prospects are for surviving into the next year. How much time do I have left, right? But I haven't seen that in the.
People at the flip think about how the way people spend time reflects value. Drive more slowly, doing more safely. You're using those time.
That's true.
Right. Next question. Fungibility of time and income. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Sam Harper from McGill University. I wanted to ask, I guess, a little bit, I haven't thought a lot about this idea of valuing time. We've been doing some work on trying to just measure aspects of time use related to a project we're working on related to daycare in rural India. And I guess I was thinking more about this issue of sort of the quality of time and how or whether you can incorporate that. So one of the issues that we're dealing with, of course, is multitasking. In particular for women in rural areas who are spending a lot of their time working and watching their children. And in the absence of having access to something, our project's on daycare, but in the absence of having daycare, they reported, a lot of psychological stress about feeling in cases where they had to leave their children to pursue their economic activities. They're worried about them. And so if they get access to daycare, they may not necessarily reallocate that time in terms of the activities they're doing, but they experience, at least reported to us, a lot of relief in knowing that their children are, safe and being fed and being taken care of. And so they're not necessarily reallocating the way they're spending their day, but the quality of that time might be very different. And I just want to know if you had thoughts about how you would think about measuring or incorporating that. Thanks.
Great question. First point, there really is a kind of a divide in the literature between all the people that are using time diaries and all these other things to show time profiles of how people spend their time, and then the people that are trying to attach an economic value to time changes. So there's much more work. We didn't try to summarize it in this paper on measuring and reporting, sort of the time profile of people's activities. But I don't see any conceptually difficult problems in incorporating your suggestion into a discrete choice experiment. I mean, we could try to capture different aspects of the activities. We just, the paper that Joe Cook has published, he tried to get people to focus just on distance, walking farther, and paying for water. So just a clear money-time trade-off. We stripped out a lot of the other attributes that might matter. You're suggesting that an attribute that really would matter is sort of how much multitasking is going on and other things they're doing. I think that could be done. I mean, again, nobody really specializes in this, right? This is not, that I'm not a value of time person, in terms of a career. I mean, it's not what I do. Lisa just asked me to write this guidance document. But yeah, but it is an issue, right? I mean, people kind of do this, very few times in their career. Of course, the theoreticians, may spend more. There is more theory here, people thinking about it. But in terms of actually doing the empirical work on estimating the value of time, it's not something that many of us. We don't get paid for it. For one thing, I mean, there's nobody out there asking us to do this work. I mean, that's it. Really, I mean, everything I've done it was on the side. Somebody's paying me to do something else, and I saw this opportunity to estimate the value of time. So, that's fun. But that's what academics do. But not, there's no market here for value of time estimates.
It's interesting though because we've gotten dragged into doing some work on value of time. Another thing.
Lisa, do you want to?
You think of all people, I could behave, right? Anyway, interesting comment though, because the paper that you guys cite is, I think, maybe the third or fourth paper we've written on the value of time, just in the U.S. context. But it's one of those things that's small, that comes up in all these different contexts. And for a long time, I would go to these meetings where people would be presenting these travel cost models that are used to value recreational opportunities. They'd use a third of the wage rate as the value of time, and I'd say, well, where did you get this number from? And they basically said, well, it's just a number. And then you'd say, how sensitive are your results to that assumption? And the answer would be very sensitive. So I think it's one of these. Value of time is one of these things that we think about as a small thing, but because it shows up in a lot of different contexts, ends up being more important than you would think.
I think it's a really important point, Lisa. I mean, I'm a water economist, and so I try to do cost-benefit analyses and estimate the benefits of water projects. Most water projects in developing countries have two main benefits. There's time savings and there's health, and there's a zillion studies on health, and there's none on time savings. But within any plausible, kind of local conditions, the time savings are often bigger than the health benefits. Believe it or not, but so we have almost no work on. Let's call it half the benefits, and and even today. We have big conferences at UNC and elsewhere on water and health, and after thousands and thousands of papers on this, we still don't have. We're looking for more precise estimates. Where the big elephant in the room over here is time saving. Dean.
Yeah, I had a very specific question, which I think the answer would have to be speculative.